At the divorce hearing, my wife boasted, "Today's the best day of my life. I'm taking everything." Her mistress smirked. My lawyer whispered, "Did you follow my plan? Good. The show begins." The divorce became her nightmare. She leaned close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same bottle I'd bought her for our anniversary 2 years ago, and whispered, "Today is the best day of my life." Sloan had always had a gift for timing. We were standing in the hallway of the Fairmont County Courthouse at 8:47 in the morning, and my wife of 9 years was smiling the way people smile when they already know the ending. And then there was Nadia. She was 27, which made her 11 years younger than me and 12 years younger than Sloan. She had that special, specific kind of beauty that reads as effortless and costs a fortune to maintain. Her blowout was perfect. Her heels were 4 inches. She stood beside Sloan like she'd been standing beside her for years, which I would eventually learn she more or less had. She was wearing the bracelet. I want you to hold on to that detail because it's important. It's a gold Van Cleef & Arpels Alhambra bracelet, the kind with the little 4-leaf clover motifs, delicate and obscenely expensive, $200 to be precise. Sloan had purchased it on a Tuesday afternoon in October, a Tuesday afternoon when she'd texted me buried at the office. "Might be late, don't wait up, and I know the price, and I know the exact day, and I know the name of the sales associate at the boutique on Vesey Avenue who gift wrapped it, because by the time I walked into that courthouse, I knew everything." But Sloan didn't know that I knew. That was the whole point. She leaned in close and she said, "I'm taking everything, Owen. The house, the accounts, all of it. You should have taken my offer when I was being generous." She pulled back and looked at me the way you look at something you've already thrown away. Quiet men lose in court. Nadia smiled at the floor, already somewhere else in her head, already spending. I said nothing. And then, from behind a marble pillar to my left, Harlan Beck stepped out. He was 69 years old. He was wearing a suit that had been well made sometime in the late 1990s and had been cared for meticulously ever since. He smelled like pipe tobacco and old books. He had a slight limp from a right hip replacement he'd had the previous spring, and he wore his reading glasses on a chain around his neck because, as he told me during our third meeting, losing time looking for glasses is losing time, period. He had argued 43 cases before the state's family court division. He had a shelf of commendations he kept in a closet because he thought displaying them was gauche. He did not look like a shark. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked at me over the glasses and asked one question. "Did you bring the files we discussed?" "Every single one," I said. He nodded once. Then he looked at Sloan, really looked at her, the way a doctor looks at a scan, and said quietly, without heat or performance, "Prepare yourself, Mrs. Hale. Today is going to be educational." Sloan laughed. Callum Reyes straightened his cufflinks, and we walked into the courtroom. I need to back up because none of this makes sense without the Tuesday in October when I found the receipt. I'd been with Sloan for 12 years, married for 9. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner when I was 27, and she was 25. And she was charming in that particular way that people in sales sometimes are. Quick and funny, good at reading rooms, good at making you feel like the most important person in the building. I'm an accountant. That's relevant. That's actually the whole story in a way. We built something together, or I thought we did. We bought a 2-story house in Kingsley Park in 2017, in large part because my grandmother had passed the previous year and left me $120,000. Her name was Rosalind. She'd spent the better part of her working life cleaning other people's houses, and she'd saved that money slowly over decades. In a savings account she called Owen's Future. She told me that once, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands folded around a coffee cup, looking out the window at a yard she'd been tending for 30 years, Sloan handled our finances. It was one of those arrangements that feel sensible when you're inside them. She was good with money, she said, and I worked long hours at the firm, and it made sense to consolidate our assets, pool our accounts, let one person manage the household portfolio while the other one focused on building her career, except I was the one building a career, and she was apparently doing something else with the time. I found the receipt on a Thursday evening in October. She'd left her blazer draped over the dining chair. Sloan was fastidiously neat in most respects, but had a specific blind spot for dining chairs, and I picked it up to hang it, and the receipt fell out of the inside breast pocket. I looked at it. Van Cleef & Arpels. 1 Alhambra bracelet, yellow gold, $200. I stood in the dining room for a long time. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't shout. I didn't confront her. I didn't call my best friend and sob into the phone. I have analyzed why in the month since, and I think the answer is that some part of my brain, the part that balances ledgers for a living, the part that understands numbers don't lie and paper trails don't evaporate, went very, very still and said, wait, look first. Understand the full picture before you move. So I opened my laptop. I pulled the bank statements going back 3 years. I built a spreadsheet. Then I built a second one. I cross-referenced every flagged transaction with her calendar and with our joint credit card records and with the rideshare account we shared because neither of us had ever bothered to separate it. The client dinners at Le Perron and Osteria Bianca, restaurants I'd never visited, restaurants I hadn't known she frequented, the St. Regis charges in our own city at rates that suggested rooms rather than the lobby bar, the rideshare trips at 2 in the morning and 2:30 and 3:15 to an address in the Ardmore district that turned out, when and I mapped it to be a condominium building. Nadia's condominium building. The weekend conferences. Denver in April. Austin in September. I pulled her expense reports. I had access. We had a shared drive. One of the last relics of a marriage that had believed in transparency. And I found the hotel bookings. Doubles, not singles. Room service for two. And in Austin, a charge at Cartier. There was a pattern to the timing that I mapped almost against my will. The 3 a.m. rides always landed on the nights she'd told me the quarterly close was keeping her at the office. The hotel doubles always fell on the weekends she'd described as mandatory offsites. Once, and this is the detail I keep returning to, she had texted me a photograph of a room service breakfast. 2 coffees, 2 plates, with the caption, "Wish you were here." And I had smiled at my phone and typed back, "Miss you too." And now I was looking at the same date on a folio that listed a second guest by initial, N period. And I kept building the timeline anyway, because the timeline was the only thing that felt solid, and every entry I added was a small betrayal I was choosing to look at directly instead of away from. I trusted her. That's the sentence I kept writing in the top margin of my legal pad. Over and over, during the long evenings I spent in the storage room we'd converted into a home office, I trusted her. Balance, 4730. I had to read it 3 times. The number didn't make sense in the context of the spreadsheet. It was like finding a typo in a legal document. Your brain refuses to process it because it cannot mean what it appears to mean. But it did mean what it appeared to mean. Sloan had a gambling problem, and she had been funding it with my grandmother's life savings, and she had been funding her mistress with my salary, and she had been doing both of these things simultaneously for years, while texting me that she was buried at the office. I sat on the storage room floor for about 20 minutes. Then I got up, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and went back to the spreadsheet. Because here is the thing about the number 4730. It was not a random loss. It was the floor of a hole that had been dug one deliberate transfer at a time, and each transfer had a date, and each date had a text message attached to it in which my wife had told me she loved me, or that she was tired, or that she'd be home soon. My grandmother had scrubbed other people's kitchens for 40 years to build $120,000, and it had taken Sloan 26 months to move almost all of it into accounts registered in countries I'd had to look up on a map, and the last $4.30 were sitting in the wreckage like the light left on in a house nobody lives in anymore. I did not cry. I did something colder than crying. I opened a new tab, labeled it evidence, and started sorting everything I had by the standard I knew a court would apply, because I had realized, somewhere in those 20 minutes on the floor, that grief was a luxury and precision was a weapon, and I could only afford one of them. I found Harlan Beck through a referral from a colleague whose brother had gone through a contested divorce 3 years earlier, involving hidden assets. My colleague described Beck as terrifying in the best possible way, which is not the kind of description that usually appears on a law firm's website. When I walked into his office, a cluttered second-floor suite above a dry cleaner on Barrow Street, with bookshelves that appeared to be losing a structural argument with gravity, he was reading something through his glasses on the chain, and he did not immediately look up. "Sit down," he said. "I'll be one moment." I sat. He asked 4 questions during those 22 minutes, all of them precise and technical, about chain of custody for the bank records, about whether the investment account transfer authorizations bore both signatures or just Sloan's, about the specific platform names I'd traced the gambling transfers to. His face showed nothing. His voice showed nothing. When he finished, he closed the binder and said, "You didn't come here for sympathy. I came for my assets," I said, "and her accountability." He smiled then, small and quiet and, yes, a little terrifying. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "Nothing, for now." I stared at him. "Her lawyer is Callum Reyes. Callum Reyes is good at what he does, which is performing confidence in front of a judge and pressuring opposing counsel into settlements before anyone looks too closely at the evidence." Beck removed his glasses and polished them with his tie. We let her walk into that courtroom completely confident. We let her lie on the record. And then we introduce her to perjury. The next 6 weeks were the hardest of my life. Callum Reyes filed a petition claiming Sloan as the primary financial contributor to our marriage, characterizing my income as supplementary, a word I found so offensive I had to put the document down and go for a walk before I could finish reading it. The petition sought the house, our joint investment accounts, and my contribution to what was described as a mutually agreed upon early retirement plan. There was no mention of my grandmother's inheritance. There was no mention of $120,000 missing from an investment account. There was no mention of Nadia. Sloan's first settlement offer arrived on a Wednesday. She offered me $18,000, the Honda, and what Reyes's letter called a reasonable period to find new housing arrangements. I called Beck. "Say nothing," he said. "Make no counteroffer. Let them read your silence as defeat." I said nothing. The second offer came 2 weeks later, slightly more generous. $31,000 and the car and 60 days in the house. Reyes's cover letter included a line about my emotional difficulty processing the transition, which I read 4 times and then put face down on my desk so I wouldn't have to look at it. I said nothing. During those 6 weeks, I kept building. Beck had connected me with a forensic document analyst named Priya Anand, 22 years in the field, certified by the National Association of Document examiners, who examined the second mortgage Sloan had taken out on the house 6 months prior, the one bearing my supposed signature. Priya Anand examined that signature for 4 days and submitted a 12-page report, concluding with the kind of professional certainty that sounds almost casual. The signature on document Exhibits A through C does not match the known handwriting samples of Owen Hale across 17 distinguishing characteristics. It is my opinion that this signature is a forgery, a second mortgage, on my grandmother's house. My name, not my signature. Beck also connected me with a CPA named Nolan Frey, 34 years in tax compliance, who reviewed the shell account structures Sloan had used to funnel money from her consulting side income. Nolan Frey used the phrase, pattern consistent with tax evasion, in a way that made my hands go cold. He used it twice, actually, very calmly, the way you say things twice when you want them to land, and I kept living with Sloan through all of it. That was the part people don't understand when I describe it now. I slept in the same house, I made coffee in the same kitchen, I said good morning and good night and how was your day, and listened to her talk about Callum Reyes' strategy like a woman narrating a chess game she's already certain she's won. She was so certain. She was almost kind about it in her way, the way people are kind when they believe they're being magnanimous in victory. I learned to hold two versions of every conversation at once. She would tell me over dinner that Reyes was confident the judge would see reason, that I should think carefully about the offer, that she didn't want this to get ugly for my sake, and I would nod and say I was thinking about it. And upstairs in the storage room there was a binder with her name on 12 different documents she did not know I had ever seen. She left her phone face up on the counter now, careless in the way people get careless when they've decided you're already beaten. I never touched it. I didn't need to. I had 3 years of her in a spreadsheet, and a spreadsheet doesn't lie the way a phone can be made to. Some mornings I would sit at the kitchen table and look at her across the counter, and I would think, you have no idea. You have absolutely no idea. And I thought, tomorrow. Callum Reyes was magnificent in the opening. I'll give him that. He was smooth and confident, and he presented Sloan as a woman of achievement, a provider, a professional who had carried the weight of a partnership that had grown unbalanced over time. He spoke about Sloan's career accomplishments. He implied, deftly and without ever saying it directly, that I had been emotionally unstable, difficult, resistant to reasonable compromise. Sloan sat beside him, looking like a successful woman, tolerating an inconvenience. Nadia sat in the gallery in a cream-colored blouse, phone face down in her lap, bracelet catching the courtroom light. The judge was the Honorable Ruth Calderon, 23 years on the family court bench, a woman who I had researched thoroughly enough to know that she had a particular documented intolerance for financial manipulation in marital proceedings, which is a polite way of saying she had seen enough Sloan Hales to recognize one on sight. She listened to Reyes' opening with an expression that gave away nothing. Then Harlan Beck stood up. He straightened his jacket. He did not look at his notes. He let the room sit in silence for just a moment, not dramatically, just enough to reset the temperature. This case, he said, is about arithmetic. He opened the binder. He went through it the way an excellent teacher explains a proof, methodically, quietly, without flourish, letting the numbers do the work. Tab A, $124,000 transferred from Mr. Hale's inheritance account to offshore gambling platforms over 26 months, documented with transfer records, platform registrations, and transaction IDs. Not market losses, not a downturn, not a mismanagement of funds, gambling losses, deliberate, repeated, documented. Sloan's lawyer made an objection. Judge Calderon overruled it without looking up from the documents Beck had placed before her. Tab B, the house down payment sourced entirely from my personal inheritance. Bank transfer on record, dated, unambiguous, and then the second mortgage, executed 6 months prior, bearing my name, and Priya Anand's 12-page report on why that name was not my signature. Sloan had gone very still. Reyes was writing something rapidly on his legal pad. Beck placed the Van Cleef receipt on the judge's bench, read the date aloud, read the price aloud, then placed beside it a photograph, Nadia, at a rooftop event 3 weeks after the purchase date, wearing the bracelet. The image was clear enough to show the pattern of the Alhambra motifs. Beck noted quietly, without emphasis, that the purchase had been categorized in Sloan's business records as Client Appreciation Q4. Judge Calderon looked at the photograph. She looked at Nadia in the gallery. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Nadia's hand moved to her wrist before she could stop it. She looked down at the bracelet like it had just become something else entirely. Too late. Finally, Beck said, and his voice dropped half a register. In the course of tracing these transactions, Mr. What Hale, a senior accountant with 7 years of professional experience, identified income routed through a series of shell consulting entities in a pattern. He placed the final stack of documents on the bench. Nolan Frey's analysis, the shell account structures, the income figures Sloan had reported versus the income figures the transfers implied. Mrs. Hale hasn't merely defrauded her husband, Beck said. She's defrauded the government. The room was absolutely silent. Sloan was looking at me across the courtroom, and I watched it happen in real time. The collapse of the version of herself she'd walked in with. The version that had told me quiet men lose in court. The smirk gone, The loose, confident posture gone. The certainty that had been so sure of the ending. In their place, something raw and afraid and very, very small. She looked at Reyes. Reyes did not look back at her. He was reading Nolan Frey's summary page the way you read a diagnosis, and whatever he found there had already told him how the next part of his afternoon was going to go. Judge Calderon set down the documents and looked at Sloane the way I imagined she'd looked at a long succession of people before her. Not with anger, not with contempt, with something that had moved beyond both of those things into a kind of tired, exacting clarity. Mrs. Hale, she said, you entered my courtroom as a victim. The records say otherwise. Reyes asked for a recess. The judge denied it. I've read that family court rulings take days, sometimes weeks. The Honorable Ruth Calderon took 11 minutes. The house was mine. The fraudulent lien created by the forged second mortgage was Sloane's legal and financial problem to resolve. The inheritance losses, $124,000 minus $47.30 remaining, adjusted for recoverable amounts, were calculated at $82,000 in damages she was ordered to repay. The Range Rover she'd leased in her name, along with its outstanding $31,000 loan balance, went with her. Her attorney's fees were hers alone. Court costs, hers. Sloane Hale walked out of that marriage with debt, a tax investigation, a car she couldn't service, and the distinct, immediate, very public attention of the IRS. She had entered the courtroom as a woman who believed she was taking everything. She left it with almost nothing that wasn't a liability. In the hallway, I watched it happen between her and Nadia. I wasn't close enough to hear the words, but I didn't need to be. Nadia had understood the way smart, practical people always understand the numbers before the emotion catches up, that the financial picture she'd been promised bore no resemblance to the financial picture that existed. I saw her face do the calculation. I saw her look at Sloane the way you look at a bad investment you've already made. You said there was money, I heard, because she said it loudly. You said you handled it, and then she turned on her very expensive heels and walked away down the courthouse corridor without looking back. She kept her hand at her side, away from the bracelet, and I noticed she didn't take it off, which tells you something about Nadia. Sloane's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Something moved through her face. She looked up at me. They've already started, I said, because Beck had told me to expect the call within 48 hours of the tax referral, and the records had gone to the relevant parties the previous Friday, faster than expected, but Sloane had always been efficient at creating problems. She stood in the courthouse hallway with her phone in her hand and looked at me the way someone looks at a landscape after the weather has completely changed. Owen, what did you do? I smoothed my jacket. I picked up my bag. The accounting, Sloane, I said. Nothing more, nothing less.